What is going on, my Catella U.S. historians, Mr. M, and my vice president? It's the M&M gang, right? It's Madison and Monroe, and that means I would be the Madison, and this guy right here would be my Monroe. There he is, Mr. Guinness, vice president. Hope all is well. I'm going to put you to the side. We're talking about an era that you love very, very much. Yes, you do. It's called the era of good feeling. Can you give me a kiss? Oh, you're such a sweetheart. Thank you. All right, old man. All right, folks. Well, let's get right into it. Now, we're starting today on page 13 of the notes. We're going to go for a few pages here today. It's going to take us towards the end of these notes. I'm only going to take about 20 to 25 minutes of your time, so let's get right underway. We're starting with the era of good feelings. That's an 8-year period, and it starts with the election of James Monroe. In fact, it ends with the end of James Monroe's presidency. We call it the era of good feelings because it's an era when the Federalist Party died out after the election, and so there's only one party in the United States during this time. And so it ended a lot of the acrimony, a lot of the negativity, a lot of folks thought, that had occurred over the last 20 years between the two major parties as they battled over their different agendas, over their different beliefs. And it was actually coined by a newspaper writer after Monroe won the election. And so it makes it seem like everything was hunky-dory, like everybody was getting along. That wasn't necessarily the case. It might be a little bit of a misleading term, but it wasn't nearly, relations between the parties or between people politically was not nearly as bad as it had been in the couple of decades before. And so in that way, it is an era of good feelings. It's also a good time in the United States. We're industrializing. We've just come off of a victory in the War of 1812. So a lot of optimism, a lot of hope, a lot of positivity for the future. Now, having just said that, there's all these issues that are going on in the country that maybe might indicate that it wasn't as much of an era of good feelings as people might have thought at the time. First off, we're starting to see sectionalism. Sectionalism is the opposite of nationalism. Nationalism is support for the country. Sectionalism is where we start to see the growth of people who are loyal more to their particular section or region of the country. And we have three sections now, no longer just North and South. Now we've got East, we've got West, and we've got South. The East and the West collectively make up the North, and the South is the South. And people start to be more loyal to their regions now during this period than they had been maybe before. And so in that way, we start to see emerging sectionalism. That's going to become a much bigger problem, especially over slavery and the tariff as time goes by. Hey, speaking of that tariff, the tariff is going to be a major issue. It's actually probably the most significant issue during this period. Remember, it's the number one moneymaker for the country. Secondly, the question is, should we be protecting American industry? And the tariff would do that. The East and the South actually usually opposed it. It was the West that was in favor. Of course, since Henry Clay and other Westerners kind of were in control of the government during parts of this period, they oftentimes did get their way. Another big debate is internal improvements. We talked about this within the American system the other day. But the question is, should the federal government be building roads and other infrastructure like railroads, or is that up to the states to do? As you remember, Democratic Republican presidents, states' rights presidents from the South tended to veto these things, and that really irritated Clay and other Westerners. There's another debate over the Bank of the United States. A lot of folks believe that maybe it benefited folks on the East Coast, it benefited wealthy bankers and industry, and that it didn't really help out poorer Americans, especially farmers. So that's going to be another issue. There's the question of the sale of public lands. Should we be selling public lands in order to pay off debts? The East actually was opposed to it because they were worried that as more people moved out west, they lost the population advantage, they would lose votes in Congress as well. The West and the South supported it, as you might expect. We're going to get a panic in this era, in 1819. Remember, panic's a fancy word for a depression. A lot of folks lose their farms and lose their homes out west as a result of this panic. And so that's going to be another reason, I think, why the Western farmers tended to be hostile towards what they called the Eastern bankers, the big bank, the Bank of the United States, and the wealthy folks that are in charge. And then we've got the big one. We've got slavery that's going to start to emerge. It's going to really start to become a major issue. It's going to increase sectionalism in this country. And we're going to get a temporary solution to it, but that's not going to last very long because the slavery issue is going to intensify and it's going to really start to get worse. All right. Well, let's get to it. Monroe's presidency, and Monroe is a two-term president, and let's go to the PowerPoint now. There he is, Big James Monroe. Actually, he wasn't big, he was small. He was like 5'2" or something like that. He was our shortest president. His presidency, and where does he rank here? He's 14th, so historians remember him pretty fondly. I should just went over all of these parts. There's two major issues during his presidency. One, there's the Panic of 1819, and then there's the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Let's start with the panic. A panic, again, is a depression. A financial panic and a depression hits this country. When people think the economy is in bad shape, they oftentimes will run to the bank and take their money out of the banks. That's bad because banks don't have the money to function. They close down. They take everybody else's money with them. That leads to a depression, especially if enough banks shut down, and that happened in 1819. Now, the major cause was over-speculation on frontier lands. What we mean by that is banks were giving out loans to people to settle out west, to set up farms, to set up businesses, to buy homes. And they were over-speculating, which means they were assuming that people could afford higher land values than they actually could. They assumed the good times would keep on going on and people would be able to make their payments, and so they gave them financing for lands that those people probably ought not to have had. This is the bank's fault. And the Bank of the United States was one of the big ones that did it. Well, what happens then is these people who can't pay their loans back, they start to lose their farms. They start to lose their homes. And of course, they're going to turn around and blame the bankers who are getting rich during this period while they're taking the lands of these poor and middle-class farmers. In addition to that, we had inflation from the war. And, we did have an economic downturn after the war. Britain started to flood our markets with their products again. Americans struggled to be able to compete with those products because the British were superior in terms of what they were making. So those two things as well contributed to this panic. So we have a number of things that hit here. And we also had a budget deficit. We were spending more than we were bringing in during this time. When that happens, that's another issue. That's another problem because we start to go in debt. And we paid off that debt with gold and silver, which meant we had a real big decline in those things. Also, here's a big one. We start to get these small banks that pop out west. They're called wildcat banks because they engaged in really, really risky behavior. They would give just really large loans to people. And oftentimes they engaged in what we would call really just not very conservative behavior. They were really risky. And oftentimes these banks would pop up for a very short amount of time. They would give out a bunch of loans. They would bring in people's money, and then they would kind of close down and disappear. So all of these things resulted in a number of bank closures, in a lot of land being lost, in a lot of debt accumulating, and inflation going on as well. The reaction to this was anger, frustration, because it affected people out west the most, and it affected poor farmers the most as well. And so farmers began to grow hostile to the banks. They blamed the bankers, they blamed the banks for bad behavior and for taking advantage of them. And many farmers started to say, you know what, if we want to change this system, we need to become more involved in politics. We need to start voting in people that represent our interests. And so it's going to lead to something called New Democracy, which is going to form in the 1820s. And that's where lower-class Americans are going to start to become much more active in politics. They're going to vote more often, and they're going to try to represent or to elect common people like themselves. In addition to that, you start to see poor folks, especially farmers out west, ask for government assistance, for instance, in ending debtors' prisons, which were still around. So that was a big issue. This panic caused a lot of frustration, especially from people out west to the banks and the big corporations in the east. All right. Our second major issue is the Missouri Compromise. This is a big one. So here's the problem. Here's the deal, I should say. Let me set it up. Missouri wants to become a state in 1819. They've got the people, and they have applied under the Northwest Ordinance, and so they ought to be allowed to become a state. What happens here is that the question was, should they be a slave state or should they be a free state, right? Because depending on what the answer is to that, that's going to potentially upset the balance between free and slave states in Congress. So whether Missouri gets accepted as a free state or a slave state made a big difference. Well, when they asked to become a state, Northerners tried to pass something called the Tallmadge Amendment. What that said was that Missouri would be admitted as a free state, and Southerners freaked out. To them, Missouri ought to be a slave state. It had a lot of slavery in it already. And a lot of Southerners were worried, like I said, they would lose the even balance that existed in Congress between slave and free state. Jefferson actually referenced the Tallmadge Amendment in one of his most famous passages. He talked about how it really awoke Southerners to the fact that Northerners were starting to want to get rid of slavery for one of the first times. He called it a fire bell in the night, that it woke Southerners up to the fact that the North was trying to get rid of slavery any way possible. And it's a concern for them because the North is growing in population. Both the East and the West are growing. The South is not growing at the same rate. And the Senate was evenly balanced between 11 and 11 slave versus free states. So what happens here is going to have a huge impact on the future of the United States. And a lot of Southerners felt, hey, slavery is in jeopardy. If we don't do something here, Missouri must be a slave state. And so the Senate killed the bill. The Southern senators killed it. And so the question remained, what would Missouri be? Well, Henry Clay steps in. Remember, he's the Speaker of the House, and he kind of fancies himself a compromiser. And he's thinking about his future political career. And he's thinking, if I'm able to make a compromise here, maybe I can use that to increase my popularity to maybe run for president or some other office someday. And so what happens here is he engineered a compromise between North and South. What would happen here is Missouri entered the Union as a slave state. That's going to make Southerners happy. In exchange, we're going to create a brand new state in New England called Maine. And that'll be a free state, and that's going to maintain the balance. Now we're going to have 12 and 12, free versus slave. But in order to get Northerners to agree to that compromise, they also wrote in that slavery would be abolished and never allowed in new states above a certain line called 3630 on the map. Reaction on both sides, neither was happy. I mean, that's kind of the case with a compromise. You're never probably totally happy with it because you don't get everything you want. But Clay was able to get enough votes from North and South in order to get it through. It's a testament to his abilities to really be masterful at running Congress. Anyways, again, we're going to create Maine here as a free state. There it is. We're going to create Missouri right here as a slave state. And then you see this line right here. It was called the 3630 line, or the Missouri Compromise line. Now, any other states that form in this unorganized territory north of that line from this point forward are guaranteed to be free. All right? Southerners didn't care so much because those states are probably not going to, be really supportive of slavery anyways. There's not going to be a lot of cash crop growing there. And Northerners were willing to accept that if they could also get Maine in exchange for Missouri. So what this does is it causes us to basically not resolve the slavery issue earlier. Instead, we kind of put a Band-Aid on it and say, yeah, we know this is an issue that's dividing North and South, but we don't really have a solution for it yet. So how about we accept this compromise and maybe a better solution will come along down the road. The compromise is going to last for about 34 years. It's eventually going to kind of die out later on. And from this point forward, slavery really starts to become a dominant issue in U.S. politics. Even if it's temporarily resolved with the compromise, slavery is going to start to become more significant. And Southerners are going to start to vote together from now on. They're going to start to vote as a block more often. Because they worry that if they lose critical votes in the future, eventually it's only a matter of time before the North has the numbers to take away slavery as well. They start to develop their own sectionalism, the South does. Again, they vote together. They start to really kind of make the same sorts of speeches. They oppose the tariffs together because they worry if they lose the tariff debate, it's only a matter of time before they're going to lose slavery as well. Clay is viewed as somebody who gets this compromise done. Later on, he is criticized by both sides because some argued that he had given in too much to each of them. While we're still going here, why don't we take a moment to talk a little bit about about foreign policy as well. And we're going to start with foreign policy during the era of good feelings. This is a good period for the United States. First, we signed something called the Rush-Bagot Treaty. That disarmed our border, the U.S.-Canadian border, since so many conflicts had broken out between the United States and England over Canada. The idea was we would no longer have militaries in that area, and so if there's no militaries there, it's less likely that a conflict is going to break out. Then just a year later, this is a big one, the Convention of 1818 was signed. John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State, signed it, and it officially established the boundary between the United States and Canada. We established it as the 49th parallel, and so even though those areas aren't really settled, we established a straight line boundary that both sides are going to follow into the future. In addition to that, since both sides wanted the Oregon Territory and both sides claimed it, we agreed to jointly occupy it together with our militaries, and we would hopefully within 10 years be able to come to a permanent solution. Ultimately, these are victories for the United States because England is starting to treat the U.S. with a lot more respect, and that of course means that we're starting to be seen more as an equal of England, or at least a friend of England, as opposed to a rival as it had been up to that point. All right? So again, the Rush-Bagot Treaty made our boundary with Canada demilitarized, which means no militaries in these areas, so there's less likelihood for wars to break out. And that means the English are going to officially abandon those forts finally, right? And we settled this boundary right here as the official boundary between the U.S. and Canada. And this area here, the yellow, the Oregon Territory, we're going to jointly occupy it because both of us kind of claim it at the same time. All right? So look at what we've done. We started with our 13 colonies and the states that grew from there. We've got the Louisiana Purchase, right, as well. We're going to get this territory from Britain as part of these deals. We're going to have a boundary that extends all the way out here now, and now we're going to jointly occupy the Oregon Territory. So the U.S. gain in strength, gain in prestige, starting to gain a little bit more respect. All right? We also gained Florida from Spain. This is a really interesting story. Andrew Jackson fought a series of wars against Native Americans. After the War of 1812, he went to war against a number of native tribes that had sided with the British. One of them was the Seminole Indians in Florida. And so he invaded Florida because he was chasing these Indians back across the border. Now, keep in mind, Florida belongs to Spain, and that's where these Indians were from. But they were raiding American settlements. Jackson shows up with his army, and he basically chases them into Spanish territory. And he starts to just move down the Florida coastline and just claim cities for the United States that belong to Spain. Finally, James Monroe gives an ultimatum to Spain. What he basically says is, listen, Spain, this Jackson guy's kind of crazy, and he might take all of Florida, and you guys can't seem to stop him. So you might as well sell us Florida before Jackson ends up taking it all anyways, and we just claim it for ourselves. And interestingly enough, Spain said okay. So they sold Florida to the United States. It was called the Adams-Onis Treaty, generally more known as the Florida Purchase Treaty, where we acquired Florida, and Spain dropped their claims to the Oregon Territory. In exchange for that, we abandoned claims on Texas, and so we allowed them to claim Texas fully. Alrighty? So again, good deal for the United States. We gained Florida. We do give up our claims to Texas, which we weren't realistically going to be able to take anyways. So another good setup for the old United States. Now Florida, too, becomes part of the U.S. as a result of this era. So it's a great era for the U.S. in foreign policy. As you can see, both Britain and France negotiating with us in good faith, treating us with a great deal more respect. Can't argue with that. That's good stuff. Finally, the Monroe Doctrine. Around this time, Americans and Monroe started to feel like, hey, this area of the world, the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, those should be our areas. Europe can have Africa, and they can have Asia. But North and South America, they should be ours, Americans say. The real reason here is there's a number of revolutions that are about to break out in Latin America, democratic revolutions, and we wanted to support those. European monarchs didn't, because these were mostly European territories, colonies. And we were really worried that Europeans were going to create or expand on colonies here and suppress these rebellions. We didn't want that to happen. And so President Madison, written by John Quincy Adams, sends a warning to Europeans, and it's called the Monroe Doctrine. It said there will be no new colonies in Latin America. Yeah, you're allowed to keep what you have, but you're not allowed to establish any new colonies, and you're not really allowed to expand them beyond what they originally look like. It was, and hey, leave those Latin American governments alone is what we warn Europe. If you violate this, we say, we'll go to war with you if we need to. Americans were positive about this. We're starting to become more nationalistic. We're seeing a lot of pride and patriotism. We've had a lot of successes over the last 10 years, and Americans supported it. Now, interestingly enough, Europeans generally didn't take us too terribly seriously. They didn't think we could back up our pledge, but they didn't challenge us. And so the Monroe Doctrine is issued, and no European countries really challenged it at the time. And Latin Americans really felt, a lot of Latin American countries actually supported the U.S. for this, all right? The significance is that it's going to become our new policy in Latin America, and we're going to start to enforce it for about the next, 100 years. Where we basically say to Europe, stay out of Latin America. You can keep what you have, but don't you dare try to expand or acquire anything new, because this is our part of the world. So again, the U.S. flexing its muscles, starting to feel a little stronger, and starting to feel like they can challenge England and Spain and Germany and Russia and all these other countries as well. Here's a political cartoon in support of the Monroe Doctrine. You see Uncle Sam, right, the symbol of the U.S., establishing that line and saying, don't you dare cross that, Europe. Don't you dare come and try to challenge us. Folks, John Quincy Adams, one of the most successful secretaries of state in the U.S. because he engineered all of these treaties, the Convention of 1818, the Adams-Onis Treaty, and the Monroe Doctrine. He's going to use that to springboard to become the next president of the United States in 1824. All right, that'll do it. Mr. M signing out. The rest of the day today, you guys are going to be finishing up those Hamilton songs. Good luck. Remember, try to make as many historical connections as you possibly can. All right, signing out with the Vice President. I hope it's an era of good feelings for you today, on Friday, and over the weekend.